Okay, I think we can start. Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar, Data Reuse Success Stories, How to Ensure Your Data is Reused. My name is Melissa and I'm a marketing executive at F1000 and I'm here to provide any technical support in today's session. So before we start, I will cover some webinar housekeeping. First of all participants will be muted throughout the webinar, but please do write your questions in the questions box, which can be found on your GoToWebinar control panel, which looks like the image on this slide. Our presenters will be answering as many questions as possible during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. However, if your question isn't answered today, we'll be in touch with you shortly after. Also, if you need to drop off the webinar for any reason, the session is being recorded and will be sent to you a couple of days after the webinar. Our speakers for today are James Parker, who is an associate publisher at F1000, and Dr. Rebecca Grant, who is the head of data and software publishing, also at F1000. They will walk you through some real-life data reuse success stories and provide guidance on how you can maximize the potential reuse of your data. I will now pass over to James Parker, and I hope everyone enjoys this webinar.
Thank you, Melissa, and hi everyone, thank you for joining. So as Melissa said, we're covering a range of topics around data reuse today. So first of all, we'll be looking at sort of some data reuse benefits, then we'll be looking at some examples of data reuse in practice, and then Rebecca will be looking at what makes data reusable, and then also 5 steps to more reusable data. So first of all, we wanted to kick off with a poll. So the poll that should be launching for you in the next couple of seconds is, has another researcher ever reused your data? So answering yes, no, or I'm not sure. So we'll just give it a couple of seconds for you to be able to post your results for that.
Okay, I think most people have voted, so I'm going to close that poll now.
Okay, thanks, Rebecca.
Can you see the responses, James?
I can. In terms of people saying yes, that's 17%. For no, it's 35%. And then finally for I'm not sure, that's 48%. So I guess the majority of people being like they're not sure if other people have reused their data. So hopefully maybe with some of the tips that we'll be going through today, though things like that might be able to become a bit more obvious to you. Okay, kicking off with the actual presentation itself. So I'm going to be looking at data reuse in practice. So first of all, a little look back at some of the webinars we've been presenting around open data over the past couple of months. So a few months ago, I hosted a webinar around open data during the COVID-19 pandemic. There's also a link down here in for the address for where that recording is available if you wanted to go check that out. But what we looked at was how open data and open software science practices in general sort of changed around the COVID-19 pandemic. So it was clear sort of over the course of the pandemic that open science and open data played a large role in navigating our way through. And you have particular examples of major breakthroughs, one being, for example, the open sharing of the SARS-CoV-2 genome that really paved the way to things like the mRNA vaccines. Were all facilitated through the open sharing of data. One other key factor that we sort of explored in that webinar was also some findings from the State of Open Data report 2020, and this highlighted that authors who had activities disrupted by the pandemic were turning to reusing either their own or other data while they can, for example, get themselves into the lab, or studies had to be put on hold. What they then decided to do was then look at what other people have published, or potentially what they had available to themselves from their own research, and reuse that data to continue on their research practices. So with that in mind, what is the use in reuse? So the reuse of data is a key sort of pillar of open data. When you're sharing your data openly, you're of course sharing it classically for reproducibility methods. So, publishing that alongside your results to allow others to be able to verify your results and potentially even go away and reproduce those results as well. But what you're also doing by putting them out there is allowing other people to then take that data and then potentially use it in different ways, either within their own studies or to perform sort of additional analyses on the content that you've presented. So in terms of looking at what these sort of benefits are, first of all, looking at the benefits to people who might be sharing their data, putting your data out there allows more people to see it and potentially use it. This increases the availability of your data as readers of the subsequent studies will then be linked back to your original publication, and through citations you'll also be able to get credit for the work that you performed producing that original data set. In some cases, these also might be data sets that you aren't using or yourself, so providing them to the community could avoid research waste for one, but also might, for example, be able to allow others to take the data sets in directions that you might have not envisioned yourself, or potentially be able to use them in ways that you might not be able to, with other groups maybe having additional analysis workflows, equipment, or expertise that allows them to go off on a sort of tangent that you may not have envisioned yourself or may not think was available to you. And an additional benefit on top of that, so you've got the sort of increased visibility, the ability to sort of reduce that research waste and potentially take that data in different directions, but also the use of that data by others often can lead to new collaborations and partnerships where, because that is data, it belongs to you, you're the one who collected it, they'll often come to you for information about that, about how that data was collected, the study that was performed, and this often leads to new partnerships and collaborations, and those partnerships and collaborations may never have occurred had that data not been shared openly for other people to see. In terms of the benefit for the people who want to use that data, from a user perspective, it's a pre-made data set that you can start to work on immediately. In the majority of cases, we're looking at data sets that also have their methodology alongside, so whether that be in your sort of classic research article where the methods are there, or with specific article types like things like data notes where you're displaying that methodology alongside the data. So you have that, both the sort of the results themselves, but then also how that was produced, so you can scrutinize how that data was collected before you decide to go away and reuse it. And also it means you can start to generate those results very quickly. If you're just going to be sort of doing a reanalysis study or anything like that, there's no need to curate or upload your data to a repository. You can just get to work straight away. And when you get to that point of publication, all you need to do is cite the original source of that data. So looking at some of those benefits here, we're going to explore them now with a couple of examples across F1000 research. So first of all, we're going to be looking at this data note. So this is a data note that's presented the draft genome for a sugarcane hybrid. So sugarcane is obviously an important plant in the sugar industry, but additionally the waste products of that sugar production process are also have uses in the production of bioethanol, with sustainable fuels becoming more and more of more and more important. This is obviously an area of interest. So this particular plant is quite complicated. It's a polyploid species with up to 130 chromosomes with a total genome size of 10 gigabase pairs. And up until the point of the publication of this particular data note, only partial or transcriptome sequences were available. So the authors went through the process of being able to generate the full genome and then made this openly available for others. And then subsequently, a group led by Santiago et al. Then used the genome to then characterize expansins within this particular plant hybrid. So expansins are a family of non-enzymatic proteins involved in cell wall loosening. And there's been experiments that showed that the overexpression of expansins in the plant can lead to increased leaf sizes. As the leaf of the sugarcane plant is one of the key sort of waste products that are used in bioethanol production, this is something that's particularly of interest. And additionally, because it loosens up those cell walls in the plant, that also provides a greater surface area for hydrolytic enzymes involved in the process of generating that bioethanol to be able to access those cell walls to break them down to generate the bioethanol. So this is an example here where the open sharing of that data, making it available for use, allowed the characterization and the study to occur where they were able to look at these expansins and profile them within this plant, something that would not have been available previously, having the genome not existed before, in its full, the full genome not existing before. So again, this is an example of that reuse facilitating work that would have been unavailable had that original data set not been shared. In the second example, we're looking at another data note. So in this one, it's a study that looks at ribosome profiling, particularly using an overexpression codon in HEC293 T cells, looking at coagulation factor 9. So what the authors did here was they profiled the cells both with a wild type F9 gene and also with an optimized F9 gene. And particular of interest here was the fact that codon optimization is a widely used technique where most codons are replaced with synonymous ones to try and increase the protein expression. This is in general assumed to not change the protein structure, but in practice, through a number of studies, this has been seen not always to be the case. So the authors want to explore where potentially the differences in the ribosome profiling would be between the wild type and the codon optimized cells. So the dataset presented both the profiles of these two variants, which is something that previously was not available in general for datasets around ribosome profiling. Then a group from Francois et al. Then came along and used this data note to then test a new Docker package for ribosome profiling. In particular, the authors noted that the dataset was selected because of the quality of controls and because quality controls have been rigorously performed, making it possible to compare the two sequences when testing RiboDoc. So this RiboDoc is, as I said, is a sort of open source Docker program that is used to perform this ribosome profiling. Up until this point, most of these groups with ribosome profiling only been around for about a decade, had their own sort of specific workflows, but there wasn't necessarily a huge amount of software out there that could be used to sort of standardize this process and something that openly other people could use. So here we have an example of number one, reuse facilitating the production of a piece of software that potentially could have benefited the authors of the original article had it been available at the time. And additionally, this also highlights one of the benefits of data notes by having the methods fully reported alongside the data. People who then want to go away and reuse that data can scrutinize those methods before they then want to then integrate that data set into their own analysis. And then one final example here, it's not from actually an article, this is actually from a blog from one of our early career research advisors on the Welcome Open Research platform. In this blog, Jana Hutter goes through her sort of journey with her research projects. So Jana works on medical imaging to study the placenta in vivo, and she's developed her own technique called Zebra, which is a combination of diffusion and relapsometry MRI that is presented in more flexible ways than previous methodologies. And as part of her project, she decided to present and share her data openly throughout it. So that was both through sort of initial testing phases all the way to sort of final results right at the end. And then throughout that process, she opened it up for people to then reuse that data, and then also provide her with feedback and suggestions along the way. She noted that having the data out there in a transparent way allowed her to have much deeper insight into the data and the acquisition techniques she used than she would have if she just put out a single publication. Noted benefits were the fact that her peers were able to identify potential improvements in her workflows, but then also spot some errors and then be able to correct those sort of in real time versus having had the whole data set published at the end where all those corrections might have not been able to occur. She noted that she noticed a clear and positive impact on her own research through doing this and allowing other people to reuse it, saying it was sort of crowdsourcing truly at its best. And additionally, through that sort of sharing and open reuse of that data, this led to her having a number of co-authorships on papers, invitations to contribute to special editions, to speak at conferences, and also opened up new collaborations. And you can see here, this is a quote from the blog itself. It said, "It was so cool to see what people were able to do with my data provided. My work being picked up and analysed with methods I barely understand felt very empowering." So this is an example of that sort of benefit of reusing data. Others may be potentially taking that data set in directions that you wouldn't have envisioned yourself, This is a perfect example, so I really encourage you. This is the link down below to the blog to go back and read through that and look at her journey through open sharing and reuse. But again, this is sort of a great story for highlighting all the benefits from reuse from start to finish for our project. So that is all from me. So I'm now going to hand over to Rebecca, who's going to talk through how to make data reusable.
Brilliant, thanks so much, James. Let's see, am I controlling these slides? Not yet. So I'll just say I thought it was quite interesting, the poll at the start. The majority of people were saying they just don't know, has their data been reused or not? So I'll try and pick up on that as I go through some of these methods of making data more reusable. And then when I come to the end, because I'm actually going to be talking about some data that I myself have shared, I'll talk about some of the ways that it's possible to know whether someone has used your data or not. I would say at the moment, it's not a perfect system though. Yeah, here we go. So what makes data reusable? As I said, I'm going to talk a bit about my own PhD research. It's actually a PhD in history, and I was using social science methods throughout. So I ended up with a few different data sets, one of them being a survey. I suppose as part of the process of submitting my thesis, going through the viva, revising, resubmitting, I did have quite a lot of the survey data in the form of a PDF. It was an appendix to my thesis. So if I want to share this with someone, what would make this reusable? I'm willing to share it, but what would somebody else need if they wanted to reuse this piece of research that I've conducted myself? So what makes data reusable? I suppose at the heart of data reuse is really the perspective of the other researcher. So this isn't really about what you know about your data or how you would use it. You're putting your data out into the world to be reused, and the people potentially accessing it won't know anything about it unless you tell them. And I think it's also important to note that nobody will reuse your data if they don't know that they can trust it. So nobody's going to integrate a piece of data into their own research if they don't trust that it's valid, that it's high quality, and so on. So people who might want to access or reuse your data could have questions like, well, who created this? What's in this file that I'm now accessing? How was it created? What was the research method? What was the process? How can I access it? If it's in the form of something like a PDF, how can I reuse it? What am I supposed to do with this PDF file? And also, what am I allowed to do with it? So am I allowed to just look at it? Or maybe I could take some data out, and maybe I'm doing a survey too, and I'd like to reuse some of this data. So no other researcher is going to be able to answer these questions without your help. And I think that's what data reuse is mainly about, just making this data more accessible, more understandable by other researchers. I'm going to be going through a few steps to creating and sharing reusable data. So I'll go through each one of these in turn, but at a high level, we're going to be talking about file formats, metadata, data repositories, data licensing, and FAIR. And if there's some or all of those terms that maybe you're not so familiar with, that's fine. I'll be going through them in some depth and from the perspective of maybe someone who hasn't done this before. So our first step to creating reusable research data is thinking about your file format. The example I gave was a PDF, and PDFs are a really great format if you're trying to present some information to humans. You'd like it to be nicely formatted. Maybe you'd like something like chapters, you'd like to embed some images. PDFs are brilliant for that. They're not very good for sharing data, however. So from a machine readability perspective, we would think of a PDF as being an unstructured document. So it's not going to give you the same functionality as something like a spreadsheet when it comes to creating column headers, allowing a machine to pull out the information and reuse it. So machine readability being in a format that computers can process. And when it comes to data reuse, I think it's important to keep machine readability in your mind. It's not just about sharing something that a human can read and understand. If somebody wants to reuse your data and maybe reanalyze it or integrate it into their research, they probably are going to be using a computer to do that. And if you provide someone with a data set that's part of a PDF, they won't be able to reuse it or to reanalyze it without doing some kind of scraping. And that means trying to remove the data from that PDF and transform it into another format. The reason I bring up PDFs is because actually at many publishers, you'll see data being shared as supplementary files in the form of a PDF. And I think it's really unfortunate because it's such an unusable format. So if you did want to think about more reusable formats, it does depend a little bit on the type of research you've conducted and the type of data you've generated. Some things you might consider though are firstly using a structured format. So for example, .csv is, I would say, the gold standard for sharing quantitative data. So that's a spreadsheet format. You might also think about using an open format, and that means a type of file format that non-proprietary software can open. So if you think of proprietary software as being software that somebody probably has to pay to license, an open format would be usable by somebody who is using non-proprietary software that they have probably accessed for free. And then finally, which format others in your discipline tend to use. So again, it is quite discipline dependent. If you're not sure what might be the best format for sharing your data, you can take a look maybe in a data repository for your discipline and see, well, how are other people sharing this type of data that I also have? So in my case, I have changed my survey. I've taken the data out of that PDF and I've decided to save it as a .csv file. But it's not just the file format that's important to think about. You should also have a think about both the human and machine readability of the data set within your file. So these are some tips there specifically about spreadsheets. Firstly, what you should do, definitely do give each column within your spreadsheet a descriptive heading that someone else could understand. So often you'll see variable names that are acronyms. Sometimes you'll see maybe measurements that aren't being defined, and you as the researcher might understand what you did and what that column means, but somebody else wouldn't. Secondly, give your file a meaningful name. So you can see my file is now called survey. I suppose that's meaningful, but it doesn't tell you very much. I think that could be improved. And then for machine readability, make sure if you are using a spreadsheet to use a single header row and make sure you have something in that first cell of the spreadsheet, which is cell A1. And that's because machines don't like having something empty in that first cell. And finally, deposit each worksheet as a separate file. So if you've got maybe an Excel spreadsheet that has a few different worksheets or tabs in it, split those out and deposit them separately. Some things to avoid: don't embed charts, comments, or tables. Again, for machine readability, you just want your data in there, nothing extra. Don't use any color coding. Firstly, because data mining and machine-based data mining can't interpret it, but also because some humans who are colorblind might not be able to interpret it either. Don't include any special characters, and that includes commas, and don't use any merged cells. So if this is a format you're using, there's a few different things to think about. Some is about allowing a human to understand. A lot of it's about allowing a machine to reuse it. So again, always thinking about machine readability when you're sharing data. Okay, so on the left now, I've got my CSV file. It's a survey. I've given it a more meaningful title. So actually this is survey data. It was a study on the management of research data at Irish organisations conducted in 2017. So now I think somebody who finds this file would at least remember what this was, that they had downloaded a file and it was about research data management in Irish organizations. So that's a bit better. Still, somebody who wants to reuse this probably has some additional questions. So they've got a high-level view of what this contains, but they probably want to know a little bit more about it. So what's in it? Again, how was it created? Who created it? Can I reuse it? And what can I use it for? And this is where metadata comes in. Again, I think this is a term you may have come across before in the course of your research. It sounded like many of you have shared data previously, so you might be familiar. But I'll just give a little explanation of what metadata involves. Basically, metadata is a way of standardizing the information that you provide about a data set. So at the bottom, I have one of the common definitions of metadata. You'll often hear people say it's data about data, or data that describes, gives information about another set of data. But really, I like to think of it as kind of contextual descriptive information. So in the left-hand column, you can see we've got some questions somebody might have about your data. So what's in this file? We would add that as standard metadata, description or contextual information. How was it created? Again, that would probably be standard metadata about description and contextual information. Who created it? In metadata, we would think of that as the creator name. Can I reuse it? That would fall under a metadata field for license and copyright, or sometimes reuse. Same, what can I use it for? And then often a standard metadata schema will prompt you to give a bit more information about the data set too. So it might be capturing things like publication date, keywords about this data set. There are a number of metadata standards available. Usually you'll be guided by the data repository that you use. They can be a bit different depending on what discipline you're coming from, and they tend to be tailored. So if you're creating a social sciences data set, you'll be prompted to add metadata that would help somebody else working in the social sciences to understand how was this data collected, what was the methodology used, and so on. So this brings me on to our next step, which is using a data repository. Again, at a high level, you can think of a data repository as being a place online to store and to share your data set, but additionally, it will allow you to add any of that relevant metadata or kind of descriptive information that somebody might need to find alongside the data to understand and reuse it. And the idea is that if you upload your data set to a data repository, you add that descriptive information, that will then be visible to any other researcher who might want to reuse that data set. There are thousands of data repositories available for you to use. I've just grabbed some logos from some of the commonly used ones that you may be familiar with. So NCBI in Life Sciences, Dryad and Figshare, Dataverse, UK Data Archive. You may have come across these before. If you're not sure what repository might be most appropriate for you, or you'd like some suggestions of what repositories other people in your discipline use, I have a link in one of the later slides to our recommended repositories listed F1000. So in my case, I have my nice CSV file that I've nicely retitled, and I decided actually that I would deposit this into a repository called Figshare. I've used Figshare before. I was familiar with how it worked. There's no charge to deposit. And I thought, yes, this is a good place to put this data set. So I uploaded it there. You can see this is a screenshot of my data set in the Figshare data repository. And you can see from the metadata that I actually deposited this back in 2020. So this is a real case study. I'm not just talking about this as a kind of imaginary example from my own experience. This is a data set that I really did share, and this is the real name of it. So this is my data set in the Figshare repository. As I said, in the screenshot, you can see the metadata that I've added. So I've given a bit of a description of what's in my data set, what I was trying to achieve when I developed the survey, and then a bit of information because this survey data won't match my published analysis, because 3 of my respondents said they didn't want the data to be shared publicly. So I've added a little explanation of why I've got fewer people in this data set than I had when I analysed the survey myself. And you can see the repository is also giving people who find and download this data set the opportunity to cite me if they do reuse it. So we'll come back to that. Sorry, my slides are very unresponsive. James, could you move me forward? Thank you. Or that might have been me. Thanks. So talking about repositories, this brings me on to our next step, which is licensing. So on the left-hand side, this is a continuation of that metadata record that I have in Figshare. You can see at the top, I've added some keywords that would help other researchers in my field to find this data set. So if they're doing a search in Figshare for something like data management, then they should find my data set. But then down at the bottom, we also have this little logo for a license. And you can see the license that I've applied to this data set is called CC BY 4.0. So if you've never used a license before, you've never applied a license to data, at a very high level, it's just telling other people how your data can be reused by them. In some cases, it will also tell people what they can't do with the data. So if you did want to have some restrictions on data reuse, you can choose a license that would allow you to do that. And I suppose the kind of most important function of applying a license is that it's removing the need for others to contact you before reusing the data. So you're basically pre-approving reuse by others, and you're telling people, don't contact me, you can just go ahead and use this, and I'm fine with you using it. I suppose kind of coming back to what we established at the start, that maybe sometimes people don't know if their data is being reused. This is maybe one of the downsides of applying such an open license. So like highly beneficial in terms of encouraging reuse. People aren't inhibited. They know exactly what they can do with this data set. On the other hand, they probably won't contact you before they use the data. In some cases, they might. They might want to know a bit more about your research, your methodology. They might want to tell you that they're about to reuse your data, and often people will. But when you apply an open license, you're telling people, just go ahead, use it. You don't need to ask me for permission. So just to give you a bit more information about licensing, because if you are uploading data to a repository, you'll probably be presented with this choice of licenses, and it's very important that you know what each of them mean. Not all data repositories will provide you with one of these licenses, which are a set of Creative Commons licenses, and there are other license types available, but they're really, really prevalent. So most repositories that you might choose to use will have one of these, and they'll prompt you to choose one. So going from the top to the bottom, these are kind of a set of licenses which run from quite permissive. So if you look at CC0 and what that means for your data, you're actually telling people they can reuse this with 0 restrictions. So there's absolutely nothing that somebody can't do with your data if you've applied a CC0 public domain dedication to it. Then as we go down the list, they become slightly more restrictive. These are all open licenses, so they're not going to be overly restrictive, but as we get down towards the bottom, more restrictions apply. So you can see that last one on the list is attribution, non-commercial, no derivatives, so the CC BY and CND. And that means that while people can reuse your data, you're saying it cannot be reused for a commercial purpose and nobody can build anything with it. So you can't build a derivative dataset derivative product on this data. If you're publishing on an F1000 platform, we will ask that you use one of the top 2, so CC0, no restrictions, or CC BY, which basically has no restrictions, but does ask that you are credited as the creator of the dataset. Okay, so we're going to go to another poll. I'll just run through the options for it. So I'm about to talk about the FAIR data principles. I don't think it's possible to run a webinar about data reuse and not mention them, but I wanted to check whether you'd heard of them. So you can say yes, no, or I'm not sure. And James has launched the poll there. Okay, how are we doing, James? Have most people voted?
Getting there, just give it a couple more seconds.
Cool, keep voting, everyone.
I think we can close it around there. So I'll just read out the results. But have you heard, so answering yes, that was 38% of the audience, no, 48%, and then not sure, 14%.
Okay, excellent, thanks, James. So I think we would say the majority of people probably aren't very familiar with FAIR, at least. So that's fine because I'm about to talk you through it. Okay, so maybe you've heard this acronym before. It's certainly becoming more embedded in policies from funding agencies, from publishers as well. When it comes to thinking about reusable data, it's really the standard. It's not really a standard, it's a set of principles for starting to think about how to make data more reusable, but it's almost become a de facto standard, I think, because we talk about it so much. So the expansion of the acronym is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And I suppose if you're thinking about data that somebody else could reuse, all of these words resonate. That all sounds great. Of course, we want our data to be findable and accessible and so on. But if I just click through to the next slide, I'm not sure how much time any of us really spend looking at these in depth. So even for the people who said that they had heard of FAIR, I guess a subset of those people might feel they were quite familiar with FAIR. I don't know how many of us could kind of quote the breakdown of what FAIR is intended to involve. To me, I think a lot of it's relatively technical, especially when you read through it for the first time. When I first encountered it, I think I found it a bit intimidating, to be honest. So for example, I suppose accessible has a meaning to us. You can think of data being accessible in maybe a more general way, but if you look at FAIR, accessible data is actually referring to something very specific. So for example, we have metadata and data being retrievable by their identifier using a standardized communications protocol. And as a data manager, I know what that means, but I think many researchers probably wouldn't. So although I think it's important to be aware of what FAIR means and what FAIR is intended to move us towards, I don't know how practical it is for researchers to use this as a guide to sharing reusable data. So if I move on, just kind of thinking about, well, okay, how can you put this into practice? If this is a kind of gold standard, a set of principles for sharing reusable data, well, what am I supposed to do with this? There are some practical steps that you can take that will pretty much align you with FAIR insofar as possible, or at least kind of start you on your FAIR journey. So I have it on the slide here. You can download the slides as well, so don't worry about remembering all of this. A lot of it are things that I've already touched on. So things like making data findable by using a recommended data repository, by adding that descriptive metadata so that other researchers can find your data. Accessibility, that's the one that was about standardized communication protocols. Actually, a lot of that can be achieved by using a recommended data repository. Similarly with interoperability, reusability, there are simple things you can do, just about publishing your data in a way where it's very richly described, where you're using standards that other people in your discipline use, using repositories that other people in your discipline use, having a clear license, making sure people understand how your data was created. So at the heart of it, I think there's a lot of maybe steps that you would have taken anyway if you're thinking about, well, how would somebody reuse this data? So we'll share the slides, and if you want to have a bit of a closer look at FAIR, I have a nice link to the Go FAIR website, which I find very helpful when I'm thinking about making data fairer. So just to kind of recap on what I've mentioned already, I moved making your data fair up to the top of my list, because really it's best to start thinking about this even before you generate the data. So when you're starting to think about your research project, maybe considering how you'll share the data at the end, that's probably the best time to think about FAIR data as well. But then some of the other things that I mentioned were creating your data in that reusable, open and machine readable file format if you can. Thinking about others being able to understand your data. So like when you open that data file, will they understand your column headers? Have you made sure that you aren't including lots of acronyms that only you are familiar with? Provide lots of information in the form of metadata about how your data was created, who created it, why it was created, when it was created, and you're going to add that when you're publishing the data in your data repository. And then finally, adding that open license so that others know how it can be reused. Again, if you're coming to publish on an F1000 platform, we have a very stringent data sharing policy that's really geared towards data reuse. So all of this would be checked by our pre-publications team as you come to publish with us. So if you're publishing an F1000, you will know that the data you're sharing alongside is as reusable as it can be. So James had already touched on some of the benefits of sharing reusable data. And I suppose having gone through this process myself, I have shared my data. I was thinking maybe of the more personal or selfish reasons for doing this. And the first one is about credit. So we've already mentioned it a couple of times, but this idea of, I mean, firstly, knowing that your data is being reused, but also getting some kind of credit when the data is cited. So I think citations are kind of the currency of scholarly publishing. It's completely standard to cite the sources you use. And you should expect when you share data openly in a data repository that if somebody reuses it, they should be citing you. And really, this is our best practice way of finding out that somebody has reused our data. So ideally, someone reuses it, you get your citation, and you then are aware that this data has been reused, you're getting your credit. Secondly, we have evidence that you can see an increase in citations to your research paper of up to 25% if you share the accompanying data. So this isn't just about people reusing your data, citing your data. Actually, if you've published a research paper where the data is open in a repository, you can expect increased citations to your research paper as well. So I've got a link to that Kolovitsa study. This research group were looking at over 500,000 published papers to establish this link between data sharing and increased citations. And then finally, continuity of your own work. So having gone through this process of kind of creating my file that was reusable, documenting my survey methodology, publishing it on the web, I know that if I decided, actually, I'd like to turn this into a longitudinal study, I think I'd like to go back to Irish organisations after 5 years and do another follow-up, all of that is documented for me. So I know exactly where my data is. I know exactly what questions I asked, what my method was, because I've documented it all to share. So if that's something you're thinking about, like maybe you want to be able to come back to your own data and maybe you use it yourself in the future, then doing all of this will really help to support that as well. And then I should have one final point. Here we go. Yeah, so as I said, I shared my own data back in 2020. I checked in on it as I was making these slides, Figshare, the repository that I used, gives me some nice usage metrics. So you can see my data set that I shared has been viewed 851 times, and it's had 210 downloads, which I find absolutely mind-blowing. Like, it's a really small study about how people archive data in Ireland, and I'm genuinely shocked that 210 people have downloaded that. If I had been cited by one of those researchers who downloaded it, then my citations would also pop up on Figshare for me. And at the moment, that's the best way that I have to track that somebody has or hasn't used my data. I guess with 210 downloads, I'm getting to the point where I'm thinking, oh, maybe someone's about to cite me. But I think, as we said at the start, it's actually really difficult to know unless you do get cited. And you should get cited if someone reuses the data, but otherwise it can be quite difficult to track. And especially given the time lag. So I published my data in 2020, it's now 2022. You can imagine that even if somebody is intending to use that data, they could still be in the process of conducting their research. Maybe they're writing up their paper, maybe their paper's going through peer review at the moment. So it's definitely takes time to see the impact of data sharing. Generally, it won't happen very quickly once you make that data available. So just some resources. If you open the GoTo panel, there's a handout that you can download there. So if you want to refer back to the slides, if you want to be able to open these clickable links with some further reading, please do download the handout. Once the meeting ends, once the webinar is over, I don't think you'll have access to that anymore. So if you did want to grab the slides, definitely do that now. So I've just added some useful links around what are open file formats. I have a link to our F1000 recommended data repositories list. A bit more information about those Creative Commons licenses, GoFair, which is a nice kind of practical introduction to fair data. And then finally, we have a really rich resource page about open data F1000. So everything else you could ever imagine needing to know about open data, I think you would find there. Okay, so I'll hand you back to James.
Thanks, Rebecca. No, yeah, just one final point. I mean, of course, with like open data and open resources, we've been publishing with an open data policy since pretty much our inception. So we're very sort of used to helping authors be able to publish their research and their data in a reproducible and reusable format. So if you would be interested in publishing on F1000, that could be a research article, maybe you have a data set that you want to present with a data note and make it available. We are currently running a 20% discount on articles submitted before the 1st of December. With this link here, having information about how you can go about and submitting it, and you can submit very easily through the website, just going straight to the top bar, and you'll have the submit your research button, so you can do it through there. If you have any queries, you can feel free to send them in. We can make sure that our emails are available. There's some contact details on the next slide. But yeah, if you are interested, feel free to send it in, and yeah, if you have any queries, then send these through to the following email addresses. So we have research@f1000.com for any general queries. You also have the open data resources down here, and then that is the website. So I think now we're going to move on to some questions.